Stay hungry, stay foolish.
So now on the Innovation Show, it's a great pleasure to welcome author and MoneyWeek writer Dominic Frisbee. Welcome to the show, Dominic.
Thanks very much, Aidan. A pleasure to be talking to you.
It's great to have you on the show, and I've just finished the brilliant Bitcoin written by your good self. What I loved about the way you wrote it is jargon-free. You've actually gone and got your hands dirty and got into this world. You know, I was stepping back and was kind of going, this would make an awesome screenplay because the story you tell, it drags you in, and it reminds me of a less sordid version of 8mm.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that tip, and I'll look out for that because I've been trying to write I can't even decide if it's a sort of sci-fi or a fantasy or a thriller, but something to do with money. And I was thinking about that while I was writing this Bitcoin book because, you know, the story of money is the ultimate power. And the person who has that power, which currently lies with the state, but it wasn't always that way. It used to be gold and silver were money, and you know the state couldn't print gold and silver. But whoever has power over money has ultimate power. And so I think as a basis for, I don't know if it's a political thriller or a sci-fi fantasy, but something. But there's something there waiting to happen. For
sure, man. I actually think you have the bones of it there. I'll actually flick you on. I have that screenplay. I'll flick you on, and hopefully it can lead to some magic. But you said it there. I mean, one of the things that I suppose I've asked people when I ask them about Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies or blockchain, most people don't know what it is. But that's because it's kind of made a little bit cryptic, and you've demystified it. But there's a bigger thing behind this, and people don't understand how can somebody just make money like this. And you say in the book, the saying they're printing money is actually true. And I thought that'd be a good way to start to give people a bit of context.
Well, Bitcoin was invented in 2008, but the kind of culture of Bitcoin was born many, many years before. And there was a kind of, there was a sort of group of libertarian techies, computer coders called the cypherpunks, who were operating in kind of the 1990s. And their kind of goal was they saw the rise of the internet and they saw the immense power that it represented. And they were really concerned about people's privacy. And so they developed the skill of cryptography. And now, as soon as you say the word cryptography, people kind of go, well, what's cryptography? And cryptography is the art of, if I want to send you a message, Aidan, but I only want you to be able to read that message, I don't want anyone else to be able to read it, then the art or the science of me sending a message to you that nobody else can read, that is the art of encoding that message so that only you and I have the keys. That is the art of cryptography. And part of the way, and there was all sorts of people involved in this movement, really kind of renegade. Julian Assange sort of came to it a bit later on before he started WikiLeaks. You know, serious players who don't like the world operating as it currently operates, and they're determined to effect change. But they're not going to affect. Peter Thiel is another one, PayPal. And he wrote an essay about this. You cannot effect political change by campaigning and lobbying and going on marches and all that thing. You have to force it through new technology. That was one of their beliefs. And so the ultimate goal of these cypherpunks was to create a new system of money that was independent of banks and governments. And if you think about, you know, as we just said, money is the ultimate power. The implications of a new technology, of a new money, independent of banks and governments, is enormous. And they also wanted nobody to be in charge of this system of money. It had to be, you know, open source, anarchic, and all sorts of alternative digital currencies got invented. But in order to process the payment, in order for somebody to ratify that A was paying this money to B, it needed some kind of central body to process the transaction. And as soon as you had a central body, there was somebody in charge of it. And so the goal was not reached. And the problem is this: if I'm standing next to you, Aidan, in a room or in a shop, and I want to pay you some cash, I can pay that cash directly from me to you, and it involves no middleman. And they wanted to replicate that cash transaction online. But every payment system online involves going through PayPal or a credit card. And even these new independent systems of digital cash involved that middleman. And and if I'm to send you a piece of computer code, if I send you an email or a video or a picture or anything, you can copy and paste that email or that video or that picture, and you can send it out to 10 or a million or 100 million different people if you want. And if you can copy and paste money, so I send you one piece of code and then you copy and paste that code to a million other people, the money instantly loses its value. And it was known as the problem of double spending. It stumped computer coders for about 20 or 30 years. They couldn't solve it, to the point at which it was deemed unsolvable. And so there was this kind of anarchic subculture called the cypherpunks, and they were trying to solve this problem, invent this system of money. And then suddenly in 2008, we had the financial crisis, and the reaction of the financial crisis was all the central banks suddenly created this money out of thin air through the process of quantitative easing. And we're still living through the consequences of quantitative easing today, because all that new money that they created it basically made its way to the rich. The assets of the rich just got more and more expensive. And, ordinary people like you and me never saw it. And it exacerbated inequality. I don't think they quite realized what they were doing at the time. But many people were extremely angry by the reaction of central bankers. And in early 2009, suddenly along came Satoshi Nakamoto, and he announced his new invention, Bitcoin, on a mailing list for cryptographers, basically for cypherpunks. And suddenly he had this, everyone started to realize he'd cracked the problem of double spending. And what ensued over the next, 5 or 10 years, well, not even 10 years, 5 or 8 years, was it just caught a nerve with all sorts of different people. Now, the first people who got into Bitcoin were computer coders, techies, geeks, because they were like, wow, he solved this problem of double spending. And this is a new technology, and it has all sorts of potential future implications. So the coders were the first people to get excited about it. Then all sorts of people, libertarians, economists, anarchists, all people who were aware of, they got excited about it because here was a new system of money that worked and it didn't involve governments or banks. So those kind of people got excited. Then suddenly black market people got excited because here was a way of buying and selling goods. And the reason that black markets hitherto had never been able to thrive online was it was that because people couldn't send each other cash, payments were traceable. And so there was a lot of risk to trading illegal goods online. But here was a new system where you could keep your identity secret. And so suddenly black markets thrived. So criminals liked it. And in fact, one of the ironies is Bitcoin has done to the drugs trade, to the illegal drugs trade, what the internet did to music and publishing. It's completely disrupted it. And suddenly, previous, drug lords and barons who had their little niches have been completely undermined by this new system of money. And who else got excited by it? Speculators. Here was this new asset class in which you could speculate in, and it was rising and falling and it was volatile. So speculators got involved in it. All sorts of new businesses sprung up as a result of this new system of money. So entrepreneurs liked it. So it just appealed to so many different groups of people for so many different reasons. And that's why it's just grown and grown and grown. And that I've rambled on, but that basically is the story of Bitcoin, which brings us sort of to the present day, where now it's not quite in the mainstream, but it's getting there.
Yeah. And, I'd love to tell the audience the story of the island of Yap and Rice Towns, because that for me was the best analogy I've ever heard of how this works and how there's record keeping. And yes, that was people, as in that was everybody knowing that X stone belongs to X person. But it's a perfect analogy for how the blockchain works and how actually there's records kept. Would you mind elaborating a bit on that story?
Sure. I'd be glad to, and it's a wonderful little story in the evolution of money. Now, we think that what we're taught about the history of money is we're taught that we use shells and whales' teeth and salt and all these things. Salt, by the way, as Roman soldiers was sometimes paid in salt. That's where we get the word salary. And then we use gold and silver and copper and nickel, and then we started using paper, and that's the kind of history of money that we're taught. And there's a tiny tropical island called Yap in the Eastern Pacific, and they evolved their own system of money. And many hundreds of years ago, there were voyagers who went out, and they went to a nearby island about 300 miles from where they were, and they found these kind of bits of sparkly limestone rock, a bit like marble. And it sparkled in the sun, and they thought it was absolutely beautiful. And they brought it back to the island of Yap, and this kind of rock was a big hit. So people kept going, and they used it as jewelry and to decorate themselves. And gradually, people kept going back to this island and bringing back more of this rock, and they would kind of carve it into a donut shape, and then carry the rock on sticks. And so, you needed several people to carry. The rocks were often so big that you needed several people to carry the stick. And they brought more and more of this rock back. And obviously it's not like gold and silver, where I can pay you a bit of gold and then that gold's yours, or I can pay you a coin and I hand the coin to you and that coin's yours. These enormous bits of rock were too big to hand from one person to the other. So they would deposit these enormous pieces of rock in locations around the village. And so, they'd put the rock outside, Steve's house. And then everyone in the village would know that rock belonged to Steve. But say at a certain point, Steve was marrying his daughter off to Gary, or Steve was buying something off Wayne, or whatever it was, then everyone would know that Steve's daughter's dowry was that rock, and that Gary now owned the rock. So even though the rock was in the village and it never changed position, everyone knew, it was recorded in everyone's memory. Everyone in the village knew who the rock belonged to. So ownership, so that it was like a central asset, but then ownership of that asset would change hands, and everyone in the village would just know, because that's how, before we had pen and paper, that's, stuff was transferred through memory and orally. Everyone would just know who that rock belonged to. And Bitcoin kind of weirdly operates on the same system, in that there's a huge database at the center of it all called the blockchain. And that blockchain is an enormous system of memory. And every transaction that's ever taken place with a Bitcoin, no matter how big or small, is recorded on the blockchain. But in that blockchain, it is also recorded who owns the coins. So you never actually receive the coins. It is just the ownership of the coins is recorded on this database. And so it's kind of, this modern system of money has got its roots in the most primitive system of money. And it's rather a nice little story.
It's a lovely story, and it really does bring it to life. And then the other one, I thought, keeping to the primitive idea, was the idea of mining. Because again, this came from the idea of mining for gold. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think that side by side with the Yap story really nail it home for people.
Sure. Well, the blockchain, which is the technology at the center of Bitcoin, I've already said it's like a huge database. And every time a new transaction takes place, it has to be confirmed and recorded in the blockchain. And until that confirmation is recorded, it hasn't taken place. But once it has taken place, it is permanent, and that record cannot be changed. And so the blockchain, and every minute new transaction records are added to this blockchain. And it is basically the most enormous system of public record ever invented. And it constantly grows. And everyone knows how the system works, that the code is transparent for everyone to see. But how on earth can a system of this size, a memory of this size, be maintained, it involves an enormous amount of computer processing power. And the way it's maintained is that computers all around the world, thousands of different computers, it's probably even hundreds of thousands now, all effectively download the Bitcoin app onto their computer, and people run the Bitcoin app. And in running the Bitcoin app, the blockchain is maintained. The records are processed and they're agreed by all the different computers on the network. Now, downloading that app involves a lot of electricity. It involves a lot of computer processing power. Why would anyone do that? So inherent in the design is that in exchange for running this app, you are paid in Bitcoins. So people actually run the app out of their own self-interest because they want to be paid in Bitcoins. And this is the process of mining. It's called Bitcoin mining. And so it's very kind of Ayn Randian, but in acting in your own self-interest, which is the receipt, mining for new coins, receiving new coins, you are actually maintaining the database for the greater public good. And it's Adam Smith said, people are enacting for their own self-interest. They do good for the greater public. That's a dynamic that Adam Smith described as the invisible hand. And so, yes. And so that's effectively how it worked. Now, the guy who designed it, Satoshi Nakamoto, was a gold bug. And so he tried to replicate the process of this idea of gold mining. So in mining for gold and taking the risks of exploring for gold and all the power that you use in mining for gold and all the capital that you risk in building a mine, the reward is the actual gold that you receive, assuming that you operate that mine well. And Bitcoin mining is a replication of that.
Yeah, I love the way, and you described this so well, Satoshi. He did this, like he thought about an architecture of how this would work. And we might go into a while about, your theories of who he is. And I know I won't give it away. I think people should read the book. But getting to that problem, you've painted the picture for us. There's a huge power in who prints the cash or who holds the cash. And what he did was he recognized that by decentralizing it and actually losing trust in the trusted party, which was the banks, and then the 2008 happened, that broke the system once and for all, even though a lot of people were crying that it's broken anyway. But that was the final straw for somebody like him. And this is a signal. And it always happens in this way where starts off with a small group, then it gains more and more momentum. And I think we're hearing so much noise today because it's actually having a bigger impact.
It was very political, and it was born as a reaction to the financial crisis. That was like the final straw that broke the camel's back. So many people are angry with the way that the world is currently run, and here was a way that change can be effected. And the authorities are asleep on this. They do not realize, they're going to try and clamp down on it when it's too late. The horse has bolted. And I don't think Bitcoin is going to replace the US dollar or the pound or anything like that, but it's going to coexist. And it's just going to eventually prove itself to be a better system of money. And the reason it's going to be prove itself to be a better system of money is, let's say you were hired for a job, Aidan, and I offered to pay you €1, or I offered to pay you €1 worth of Bitcoin. To do, or so let's say €100 for €100. You can have €100 or €100 worth of Bitcoin. Now, that €100 that you get, what you can buy today with that €100 is more than what you will be able to buy next year. And in 3 years' time, the €100 will probably only buy you $90 worth of what it would buy you today, because just the price of everything goes up, houses, food, whatever it is. But on the other hand, the Bitcoin, if you look at a Bitcoin, if you've been paid €100 worth of Bitcoin 5 years ago, well, that's like more than 10 grand today. So what would you rather be paid in? A money that actually increases in value, or a money that loses its value? And the answer is everyone would prefer the money that increases in value. And so more and more people are going to want to be paid in Bitcoin, to sell their goods in Bitcoin, and you will have what's called the network effect. You're already seeing it. And the herd has already become a stampede, but the stampede will just get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and therefore we're seeing, like the reactions in China. We're seeing like reaction where it's like if any of our traders are caught trading Bitcoin.
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan.
That guy sort of got a point. I mean, everyone jumped on his back and said, Jamie Dimon. He said, if it gets too big, the US authorities will close it down. Well, they can't. There's so many criticisms you hear of Bitcoin come from people who don't fully understand what they're saying, and the inventors and the technology, they're so far ahead of the curve. They've already thought of that. Now, sure, a Bitcoin exchange can be shut down, or it can be made illegal to have Bitcoins. But how on earth can you police it? You cannot. A war on Bitcoins would be even more futile than the war on drugs has been.
Yeah. You've seen these people who have been made millionaires overnight. You've participated in the parties.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not one of them, because I had a low, but they got nicked way back when. That's another thing that Bitcoin does, is it forces you to improve your own discipline and your own habits. And I was a bit lazy early on, and I had my email hacked. Somebody got wind of the fact that I had some Bitcoins, and I got my email hacked, and there was an archived wallet in there. I didn't realize it, and I had my Bitcoin stolen. So, more fool me. I mean, I love the whole thing, but I should be a multi-trillionaire now, and I'm not.
Wow. Did you have that much? Yeah.
Well, you really didn't need to have that much.
Yeah.
I did somebody in London is selling this Russian dude is selling his house in Notting Hill for £18 million, which is, 22 million euros or something like that. And he's only accepting Bitcoin.
Wow.
And this is a big news story in the UK this week. So I went round to his house this week, and it's a nice house. It's a big house in Notting Hill, but it's not that nice. And anyway, £18 million. Now, I looked in my archived emails to see the first time I ever got wind of Bitcoin. And it was in December 2010. It was mentioned at the end of a newsletter that but it's one of those emails you get, you just flick through it. And I think I must have flicked through it and thought, that looks good, and not really looked into it anymore. But Bitcoin at the time was 22 cents. Now, if I'd bought $1,000 of Bitcoin, that would have been roughly 5,000 Bitcoins. But just for the sake of this, let's say I bought $1,050 worth of Bitcoins, because that would be 5,500 Bitcoins. So I spent just over $1,000. The price that the guy who's selling that £18 million house is asking is 5,500 Bitcoins. So for a $1,000 investment in 2010, at the end of 2010, I could be buying an £18 million house.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary. We'll never, ever see another investment opportunity like this in our lifetimes. And I'm afraid, it might still be an opportunity now, but it's not the opportunity it once was. This will story break your heart. There's a guy I knew who got into mining Bitcoins very, very early on, clever techie guy. He was living in London at the time, now lives in Perth. And he used to leave his laptop, his office laptop, running, mining coins overnight while the office was closed, and then come back in the morning and collect the coins. And he did this over a period, and he built up a huge stash of coins. And when he left that company, the company took the laptop back and wiped the hard drive.
Oh. Yeah.
I mean, that's millions and millions of pounds worth of, or euros or dollars, whatever currency you want to use, but of Bitcoins just wiped.
Yeah, and you mentioned a good few stories of this in the book, and people who traded for a beer and stuff like that. But
there's a guy who bought the first Bitcoin transaction was 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas. That's $50 million today. Yeah. $50 million for 2 pizzas.
And you've been party to those kind of Playboy Mansion type parties that some of these guys have had.
Like I was into mining before, gold and all this, and the mining lunches are notorious. When mining companies are trying to raise money, they take you to the most lavish lunches and really lubricate you before they try and sting you for a huge check. And I've been to some properly lavish dinners and lunches, but this Bitcoin dinner that I went to, like, £500 bottles of wine, one after the other. I mean, it was amazing. And one of them, everyone who went to the dinner had their Bitcoins nicked.
Oh my God.
and it was a Bitcoin dinner, and some hacker had heard that there was this Bitcoin dinner, and including me, and I don't know how he did it, but he got everyone who was at that dinner, and there are some big players in the Bitcoin scene, I can tell you. And some of them, I don't think some of them will admit to having had their coins nicked. But anyway.
Wow. Yeah. So, but the funny thing is, the code that Nakamoto did is actually rock solid, isn't it? I mean, that was one of the big
there's
things.
A difference between having your Bitcoins stolen and hacked, but the actual blockchain itself is unhackable.
Yeah.
Loads of people have tried to crack it and they can't. They've had like the top guy from, I can't remember his name, Dan Kaminsky or something. He's the top guy, the top American hacker. He's like cracked everything and he can't do it. He's just said it's the strongest code he's ever come across.
That's phenomenal. And when you think of the architecture and then the coding, and I know, you say that there's been way more than one person involved in developing this, and a lot of contributors. But it'd be great to just take a little segue for a second, which is, so people will have heard now that it's probably a little bit late to get in on Bitcoin, or it's expensive certainly to get in now. But the one thing that a lot of people have asked me is, how are all these new coin offerings? What are they, and what do they look like sitting beside Bitcoin and on the blockchain?
I have to say, I haven't actually done one yet, and I'm not sure I entirely get them. But this friend of mine's leaning on me to do one, which closes next week. So I'm looking at it now. So let me answer that question for you next week. I mean, I'm not sure I entirely understand them, but just because I don't understand them doesn't mean they're a total racket. I'm sure there's loads of people. It's a bit like, it's a new technology. It's a bit like .com in the 90s or railways in the 1830s or the 1870s. It's a new technology. Everyone's throwing money at it. They're laying railways and laying cables and doing all sorts of stuff. And most of it will just go up the Swanee. But, that's what happens with new technology. It's experimental. And so, some of it will work and some of it won't.
Right. Okay. So it's just people trying different things, and hopefully it's like startups essentially. It's
startup mania. I bet you the hit rate, like you look at all the crowdfunding sites, their hit rate's pretty low. I think it's 90% of the businesses don't make money. It'll be the same with ICOs or any kind of venture capital. The reality is most businesses don't make money.
Right. So then,
most startups don't.
Most start, exactly, yeah, and most fail. When you look at other uses, because you mentioned the blockchain and how it works and how it keeps this public record, there's lots of other uses for that as well, other than just currency.
Yeah, loads. Let me ask you a question. Of the plethora of religions that were around in the Middle East, 3,000 years before Christ in ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia and all that, of all those religions that were around, why did Judaism survive and none of the others? They wrote it down. They were the only ones who kept a record. 10 Commandments and all that inscribed in stone. Why did Christianity supersede all the pagan religions in Northern Europe in the Dark Ages? For exactly the same reason. Christians wrote it down. The pagan religions were all passed on orally. You cannot underestimate the impact of record keeping on the course of history. And here is this blockchain, this new system of record. And it's not just financial transactions that you can use the technology to record. You can record ownership. And so once you can record who owns what, you can then use the technology to trade ownership. So you'll see the technology used to trade financial assets, stocks, shares, bonds, but even things like cars and houses. A couple of nations have already starting to record land registry on a blockchain. And once you have the trading of ownership, it's a small step from there to contract law and the automation of contracts. So you'll see contracts executed, drawn up by computer coders rather than by lawyers. And the execution of that contract will start to take place automatically. So it's going to have implications for the legal system and lawyers. Things like, if I am Louis Vuitton and I make a new bag, I can record that this bag was made on this date with this serial number. I can record it on the blockchain. And thus, you know whether you are buying a genuine Louis Vuitton bag or a fake. So you're going to see it used in authentication and notarization, the authentication of goods, of diamonds, of documents, and even the authentication of you. It's a wonderful way of proving who you are. At the moment, to prove our identity, we use a username and passwords. That's the system that operates on the net. But it's actually a rather clunky system, and it's easy to hack. And people are really lax with their password management and all this stuff. Well, we're going to see blockchain technology used in authentication of you. And then we also see it would also be used in voting systems. It's once, if you think what a big deal it is to arrange a referendum or a vote, it costs the government a great deal of money. And, it's pretty easy to vote fraudulently if you really want to. With blockchain technology, the technology will soon be there whereby you can vote on anything and for a fraction of the cost with 10 times the level of security from your mobile phone. And people are getting more and more politically engaged at the moment, particularly, with Twitter and on Facebook and with social media and all that. And, they're demanding more of a say in political decisions. And the technology will now be there for them to vote on political decisions. And once the technology's there for them to vote, people would demand a vote. And so we're going to move. Currently, we operate on a system of representative democracy. Well, we're going to see, and politicians will resist it, but ultimately, they try to resist the Brexit vote, but ultimately the people voted for it. So you're going to see transition from representative democracy to a more direct democracy, and the blockchain's going to be fundamental to that transition.
Yeah, this word comes up the whole time, and I actually just pulled a definition of it. So disintermediation, right? And the
disintermediation, yeah.
So, and I know this is key to it, and I'm just going to give the definition from the dictionary. So, a reduction in the use of intermediaries between producers and consumers, for example, by investing directly in securities market rather than through a bank. That's a huge word for this, isn't it? That's a huge collapse of this, where actually the intermediary is now under threat. This trusted party in the middle is no longer required in a lot of cases.
It is the most enormous force of disruption and disintermediarization, to use the buzzword. What a terrible word.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. So you're going to see, I've just described how politicians will be disintermediated by the technology, and they will become administrators of the people's will. At the moment, let's say your MP is 20,000 people in your local seat, 9,999 vote for the Labour Party and 10,001 vote for the Conservative Party. And so there's a Conservative MP who represents the will of the people in that area. Well, 9,999 people have got views go on unrepresented. And in fact, in the case of the Brexit vote, the majority of British people voted for it, and there was something like 75% of MPs voted against it. So there's often a very different, politicians often represent a very different attitude to the people they're supposed to represent. Well, they're one group that will be disintermediated by this. Lawyers, as I've just described, are going to be disintermediated by it. Financial institutions, banks, we no longer need a payment processor to process our payment. I can send money directly from me to you. Banks will be disintermediated. Notarizers, it's enormous. The implications are enormous. Banks and politicians are the two most powerful groups, effectively, and their models are threatened by this, and they cannot see it coming. They are asleep at the wheel.
Yeah.
But technology is a bit like, you can't stop the printing press. Once it's been discovered, it's an unstoppable force.
Yeah, but I just always think it's the zeitgeist. It's a signal of something bigger, which is this almost uprise against capitalism, and people's desires have changed massively in the world, and this is just a signal of what's coming.
My line I'm most proud of in the book: the revolution will not be televised, it will be cryptographically time-stamped on the blockchain.
That's brilliant. Actually, do you know there's another one you say in the book, and I had never seen it before, and it's Ulbricht's quote.
Yeah, Paul Ross Ulbricht. Yeah.
He says the only way to change the government is by changing the governed. I love
Yeah.
that quote, man. That is an awesome line. It's a very, very similar one. But
I'd forgotten that one, actually.
oh, it's an
It's
awesome
better
one.
than mine.
No, yours is probably a little bit more techy, but will, and you say this as well, the language of all this, Bitcoin and the blockchain, etc., is a bit foreign to people right now. But that was like the @ sign in the 90s. This stuff will all become common parlance. But could we talk a little bit about Silk Road? Because I thought this is where you saw, disintermediation in practice, in that you didn't need this person in the middle anymore. And it's when you think of the other forces at play, the gig economy, in coming alongside this, and then you have a way of actually paying people without having this party in the middle having to, and taking a little cut all the time. There's huge disruption coming around the line, and we saw that in the drug dealing world, in particular, with the Silk Road.
Yeah, well, the Silk Road was like the first online drug marketplace, and it was basically followed exactly the same principle as Amazon or eBay. It put buyers and sellers together, and they traded. It was an online marketplace, and sellers advertised their goods, and buyers bought the goods, and then the sellers would send the goods, and the buyers would send the bitcoins, and the marketplace would hold the bitcoins until the buyer confirmed he'd received the goods, and then the bitcoins would be sent to the seller. And the whole thing thrived quite simply on the review system. Good buyers and sellers got good reviews, and bad buyers and sellers got bad reviews. And so the more good reviews you had, the more trade you got. And it was wonderfully simple, and Bitcoin made the whole thing possible. And after about a year and a half trying to crack it, the FBI eventually got him. And the guy behind it was Ross Ulbricht. And rather comically, he was the guy who ran the whole side, and he described himself as the Dread Pirate Roberts, reference to the film The Princess Bride. And he eventually got busted. And within a week of the Silk Road closing down, there were 20 copycat sites. And so, now there are hundreds. Every 6 months or so, one of the sites gets busted, and then there's a load of new ones spring up, and the online black market is now thriving. It is huge.
But it's key. The Dread Pirate Roberts. Firstly, I'm a nerd who knew who he was. I loved that movie. But the key part of that, and it reminds me of even Saw. The movie Saw. That's and it's not about the person. It's about the position, and it's about the mindset. And that idea of the Dread Pirate Roberts is, it doesn't matter who it actually is, it's what they stand for.
Exactly.
And that's why we're seeing all these copycats, because again, it's a sign of this signal that people want change.
There is change in the air. It's not coming, it's happening.
Yeah. What do you see coming in the future? What do you see for banks, politicians? What do you see for, lawyers? Like, there's massive disruption coming to these people. But yet again, the governments aren't doing anything about it because they don't understand it. But either are those professions.
Yeah, well, some of the banks are, to be fair, they've all got little blockchain arms, and they're investing money in it and investigating the technology. But it'll never be the same as a guy getting his hands dirty at the coalface. There are all sorts of trends coursing through the world at the moment, and Bitcoin and new financial technology is a big one, but it's just one of many. There's an appetite for change. There's a sort of psychological demand for change. And so you're seeing that manifested in the rise of more extreme alternative politics, whether it's on the left or the right. The Brexit vote showed how people want something different. They no longer want to be ruled by, unaccountable bureaucrats. The one trend that few people talk about is just the sheer size of debt which governments owe, unpayable debt. And the only way they're going to get round this system of the unpayable amount of money they owe is by suppressing interest rates, financial repression, as they call it, and devaluing money. Well, the more they do that, the more inequality will occur, and the more angry that people will get. And eventually, if they lose control of money, of interest rates, and we get and the bond market suddenly decides that it no longer wants to lend governments money unless they push up interest rates, well, we're going to have the most almighty debt crisis and currency crisis on our hands. And that is going to create a lot of anger as well. Governments are currently spending way more money than they receive in tax revenue. And so another big trend we're going to see is clamping down as they try and raise taxes to cover their backsides. So that's another trend that we're going to see as we move forwards. And so there's all sorts of clashes going on. I think, we've seen Brexit. We saw the Scottish independence vote. We've seen the Catalan independence vote. The Kurds have just voted in Iraq. I think it was a non-binding vote or something. I don't really know, but I just think we're going to see more and more. Jamie Bartlett's written a very good book about this, but the sovereign borders, as we now know them, are actually a relatively new thing. In many cases, less than 100 years old, and he just sees, return to the old kind of city states or a modern equivalent of city states and smaller nations. And, the internet is blurring national borders. National borders are such an irrelevance. And the internet is just, I'm talking to you, and actually the Irish-British border, I just flew back from Cork last week, is actually pretty easy as borders go. That's because of the long history between the two countries. But I just think borders are going to disappear. Yeah. And the way that we're governed is going to change. And this is change. People you look back at history and they go, that was the day the world changed, and that was the day that this happened. But actually it's all gradual and often, but you get these kind of days which are, days when something spills over, but all the time the glass is filling up with water, and then it'll spill over again. And, so there's a lot of, it's a gradual process, but it's happening. And multiple trends.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. One last question for you, and I know Life After the State, Why We Don't Need Governments is another brilliant book written by you, and I highly recommend it. And they're all available on DominicFrisbee.com. And where else can people, you're on Twitter, etc., Dominic, where else could people
if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Dominic Frisbee, and I guess that's the best place to go. And then from at Dominic Frisbee or DominicFrisbee.com, and I've got a YouTube channel and a podcast, and I write books and I write articles. But anytime I've got any content that I want somebody to consume, I normally post it on Twitter. So that's probably the best place to start, at Dominic Frisbee.
Yeah, and before I ask the last question, also, you speak prolifically and very, very well all around the world as well. So I highly recommend that for people as well for your next event. But the question I was going to ask you was, so in a world that's, facing all this disruption, artificial intelligence, people are talking about UBI and AI overtaking a lot of roles, and we're going to see roles disrupted like this. And then you look at the education system, it's not preparing them for this.
No.
So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my eldest is 16. We travel as much as possible. He's in the education system. I think really if I'd had a bit more courage, I would have home educated him, but it just wasn't possible in my circumstances at the time. You just got to get out there and get your hands dirty and live life to the full and experiment and try new things and be safe. But unless he does extremely well in his A levels and goes to one of the top 2 or 3 tiers of university, I almost don't see the point of university anymore, because you're not special. Like once upon a time, if you went to university, it made you special. But now all kids go to university. And by the time you're 21 or 22, you're actually more special if you haven't been to university and you've got 3 years, 4 years solid experience doing something. So, I'm not necessarily going to push them to go to university. Plus, there's all the debt that you get into, and students leaving with crippling amounts of debt. And then, debt is the slavery of the free, as the saying goes. They cripple themselves. And so, the way that debt's been introduced into further education is insidious.
Especially in the States. It just cripples people.
Well, it's terrible everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worse of all. But people are writing about the student debt bubble bursting in the States. How's that money going to be paid back? It's not. Default is the only way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, man. And I'm the same. I'd love to have an option just to disrupt the way my kids are educated. And I suppose we can play a huge role as parents to do that.
Yeah, we can. Well, I just encourage mine to think. But you see, mine just did his history O level, and he did all right in the end. But there was one of the essays was all about laissez-faire economics in his history, you know, laissez-faire in the 19th century. And he's heard me sounding off about why laissez-faire is a good thing. And so he wrote this essay and he argued in favor of laissez-faire. And I was thinking about it, and I said, you're going to get marked down for that, because that's not a view that is held by most history teachers. They have the opposite political view. And even if the teacher is open-minded enough to go, actually, you know, that's a good, even though I don't agree with it, that's a good essay, you're still going to be, you know, people mark you up if the things you say confirm their biases.
Absolutely.
And so so I had to sort of say to him, look, you're going to have to lie. When you next, like he's doing economics for A level, I'm just going to tell him, lie. Even if you don't actually think this, it's a good discipline to argue something that you don't necessarily agree with. It's a good to be able to know how to make an argument, even if you don't agree with it. But you're going to have to, you know, often it pays to just say what people want you to say, even if you don't think it. Isn't that a terrible thing to tell a kid?
I know.
You should say, stand up for what you believe. But unfortunately, that's the way. Anyway, well, I'm slightly confused on what to tell him, and he's probably getting confused.
But it's actually, and it's the same for.
But in terms of like getting recognition from an exam board, you just got to tick the boxes.
Yeah, it always reminds me of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where he gets lobotomized, to fit in. You know, and you're going, the world only makes progress thanks to people who don't fit in.
Yeah,
and yet we're training them to fit in. It's nuts. Anyway, man. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Dominic, and I'd love to have you on again, you know, when the next book comes out. 3 brilliant books. Let's talk about tax, Bitcoin, Life After the State, all available on DominicFrisbee.com. Dominic Frisbee, author and writer with MoneyWeek. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.